In the heart of New York City, there was an old, decrepit apartment complex known as Liberty Heights. This building had seen better days, and many of its residents had moved out, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to haunt its empty hallways. Those who remained were mostly the elderly who had nowhere else to go. It was a foggy January evening when the nightmare began. Susan, a retired schoolteacher, lived alone on the third floor. She was known for her kindness and generosity, often helping her neighbors with groceries or a warm meal. That evening, as she was preparing her dinner, a knock echoed through her apartment. Startled, she walked towards the door and peeked through the peephole. A man in a police uniform stood on the other side, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his cap. He had a stern expression, and his badge glinted ominously in the dim light. Susan hesitated for a moment but decided to open the door, trusting the uniform. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "I'm Officer Jack. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this building. May I come in and ask you a few questions?" Susan nodded and stepped aside, allowing the officer to enter. As soon as he crossed the threshold, a chill ran down her spine. There was something off about him, something that made her uneasy. He began asking questions, but they seemed strange and irrelevant, like he was probing for something more personal. "Have you noticed anyone new around here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room intently. "No, officer. Just the usual people," Susan replied, trying to keep her composure. The officer's gaze fell on a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of Susan with her late husband. "Your husband, when did he pass away?" he asked, a peculiar interest in his voice. 2 years ago, Susan answered, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt an urge to get this man out of her home, but fear held her back. The officer continued his questioning, each one more invasive than the last. Susan's unease grew and she regretted letting him in. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stood up and thanked her for her cooperation. "If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, please call the police immediately," he said, handing her a card. Susan took it with trembling hands, and as soon as he left, she locked the door and bolted it shut. That night, Susan couldn't sleep. The officer's questions replayed in her mind, and she decided to check the card he had given her. When she looked at it, her blood ran cold. The name on the card was not Officer Jack, but someone else entirely. The number was also strange, not matching the local police department. The next day, Susan went to the nearest police station to report the incident. The officers listened to her story with concern and confirmed her worst fears. There was no Officer Jack in their ranks, and the number on the card was not theirs. "We've had similar reports in the area," one of the officers said. "Someone impersonating the police, preying on the vulnerable. We'll increase patrols around Liberty Heights." Susan thanked them and left, but the sense of dread lingered. Over the next few weeks, more residents reported encounters with the fake officer. Each time he seemed to be looking for something or someone. Then one night the horror escalated. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman living on the first floor, was found dead in her apartment. The cause of death was unclear, but there were signs of a struggle. The police suspected the imposter, but he remained elusive, like a ghost slipping through the cracks. Fear gripped the remaining residents of Liberty Heights. They formed a neighborhood watch, taking turns patrolling the hallways and checking on each other. Susan, determined to protect her neighbors, joined the effort. One foggy evening, as she was on her shift, she heard a faint cry for help from the basement. Heart pounding, she cautiously made her way down the creaking stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and forgotten corners, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Hello?" Susan called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" A weak voice responded, "Help me, please." Susan followed the voice to a locked door. She fumbled for the keys and unlocked it, revealing a young woman bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Susan rushed to her side and untied her, helping her to her feet. "Who did this to you?" Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman, tears streaming down her face, replied, "It was him, the fake police officer." Before Susan could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, grabbing her by the arm. The imposter's face was twisted with anger, his eyes burning with a malevolent fire. Susan struggled, but he was too strong. Just as she thought it was the end, the sound of sirens filled the air. The real police had arrived, alerted by the neighborhood watch. They burst into the basement, overpowering the imposter and rescuing Susan and the young woman. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained. The residents of Liberty Heights never forgot the terror they had faced, and the building remained a symbol of their resilience. Susan, though shaken, continued to live there, her spirit unbroken. She often wondered about the fake police officer, what drove him to such madness, and whether he was truly gone. But one thing was certain: she would never again open her door to a stranger without caution. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Ridgewood. The sun had set, and the streets were deserted, save for the occasional car passing by. Lisa, a nurse at the local hospital, was on her way home after a long shift. She drove down the lonely roads, her eyes heavy with fatigue. As she reached the outskirts of town, she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was signaling her to pull over. Confused but compliant, Lisa pulled to the side of the road and waited. The officer approached her car, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said in a calm, authoritative voice. "Can I see your license and registration, please?" Lisa handed over her documents, her heart pounding. The officer examined them for a moment before returning them. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, officer. I don't," Lisa replied, her voice trembling slightly. "You were swerving a bit. Have you been drinking tonight?" he asked, his tone suddenly more accusatory. "No, officer. I'm just tired from a long shift at the hospital," Lisa explained. The officer seemed to consider her words for a moment before nodding. "All right, ma'am. Please step out of the vehicle for a sobriety test." Lisa hesitated but complied, stepping out into the chilly night air. The officer led her to the back of her car and began the test. As she followed his instructions, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes had a predatory gleam, and his questions seemed more like interrogation than routine procedure. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally told her she was free to go. Relieved, Lisa got back into her car and drove home. But the encounter left her shaken, and she couldn't stop thinking about the officer's unsettling demeanor. The next day, Lisa decided to report the incident to the local police department. She described the officer and his behavior to the desk sergeant, who listened with a furrowed brow. "Ma'am, we don't have an officer matching that description on duty last night," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sure it was a police car?" Lisa's heart sank. She was sure. The uniform, the car, everything had seemed legitimate. But now doubt began to creep in. Over the next few days, more reports of a rogue officer started to surface. Residents of Ridgewood spoke of a mysterious police car pulling people over, the officer inside always acting strangely. Some even claimed to have seen him disappear into thin air. The local police launched an investigation, but no leads emerged. The sightings continued, each one more unnerving than the last. People began to avoid driving at night, fearful of encountering the phantom officer. One evening, Lisa received a call from her friend Emily, who lived on the other side of town. Emily sounded panicked, her voice trembling. "Lisa, I just got pulled over by that officer you told me about," Emily said. "He was acting so strange. I thought he was going to hurt me." Lisa's blood ran cold. "Did you get away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, but I don't feel safe." "He's out there, Lisa," Emily replied. That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the officer, the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere, his sinister presence haunting her thoughts. She decided to do some research, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious figure. She combed through old newspapers and online forums, piecing together a chilling story. Years ago, a police officer named Jack Wilson had gone rogue, using his position to terrorize the residents of Ridgewood. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life in prison, but he died under mysterious circumstances while in custody. Some believed his spirit had never left, continuing to haunt the town in search of victims. Lisa's heart pounded as she read the accounts of Jack Wilson's reign of terror. The description matched the officer who had pulled her over, down to the predatory gleam in his eyes. Determined to put an end to the nightmare, Lisa gathered a group of friends and local residents. They patrolled the streets at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom officer. For weeks they saw nothing, and some began to doubt the stories. Then, one foggy evening, as they were about to call it a night, they saw him. The police car appeared out of the mist, the officer inside staring at them with cold, dead eyes. Lisa's heart raced as she approached the car, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Jack Wilson," she called out, her voice steady despite her fear. "We know who you are. You don't belong here."